You are good to go, sir.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. If you didn't see the music and the Bible study information, they're right there when you first walk in. Did everybody get a sheet? Okay. Jill, did you get your stuff when you came in? Did you get your music and Bible study? All right. Good to see everybody today. It's a blessed day, so we're going to say, blessed be the name. How'd you like that? That's what I tied.
That's a professional.
God is flowing.
All right, Julie. Sing. All praise to Him who reigns above in majesty supreme, who gave His Son for men to die, that He might men redeem. Let me hear ya. Blessed be the name, blessed be the name, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be the name, blessed be the name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. His name above all names shall stand, exalted more and more. At God the Father's own right hand, where angel hosts adore. Blessed be the name, blessed be the name, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be the name, blessed be the name, blessed be the name of the Lord. His name shall be the Counselor, the mighty Prince of Peace, of His kingdom's conqueror, whose reign shall never cease. Blessed be the name, blessed be the name, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be the name, blessed be the name, blessed be the name of the Lord. Sing that chorus one more time. Blessed be the name, blessed be the name, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be the name, blessed be the name, blessed be the name of the Lord. Great job, good job, good job.
Julie.
Thanks, Julie. Wanted to welcome Beulah for her first time with us. Yay, Beulah. And we have a new person, Susan. Welcome, Susan.
Amen.
Welcome, Susan.
Here comes
When Shirley came in, I said, hello, who are you? She said, my name is Susan.
Susie Q.
Susan.
the
So anyway, all right, so for today's trivia, again, you can guess one time. But we have a variety of prizes you get to choose from today. So it's not just the Starbucks card, it's a few other things. So, in 1968, I was 4 years old. I'm not going to ask you how old you were. But in 1968, I was 4 years old. And there was a popular game show that premiered at nighttime for the very first time on this day in 1968. Laura?
Price is Right.
No. Linda?
Dating game.
Nope. Angel?
Jeopardy.
Nope.
Diana said newlywed game.
No.
I'm going to guess that. Password.
No.
Child program.
It's a game show. It's a game show. A very popular daytime game show that premiered at night for the very
This is
first
your life.
time.
Let's make a deal.
No.
Price is Right.
No. I'll give you a hint. Think of the Brady Bunch. That's your hint.
Hollywood Squares.
Hollywood Squares. Hollywood Squares.
Ah, good hint.
Good hint. The Brady Bunch was like, I didn't want to say 9 people, I just wanted you to figure out the Brady Bunch. So,
was too busy taking care of my kids. I did
So
not do that.
Yolanda is the winner, and I'm going to come back and give you your variety. But now Donna is going to come up in a second, but I wanted to say this first.
Amen.
I know we're going to talk about lunches upcoming future, but we are doing the Valentine's luncheon on the Wednesday next month, and it'll be during the Bible study time. And it'll be an Italian covered dish luncheon. Okay?
Are we bringing it or what?
Yes, yes. Okay? So whatever,
Instead of
instead of the going out, yeah, we'll do the Italian. We'll have a Valentine's
We'll
party.
replace the lesson most likely.
We might have a little bit of a love lesson that day. Since it's Valentine's. Yeah.
Yes, we'll do a depot.
And it's
Yeah.
February the 14th.
All right. Thanks, Donna.
Is it the 14th?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am glad to be back. I had a lot of issues on the holidays, especially my cold, and I didn't have COVID, so I was tested and I was good. I just had a cold. But anyway, you know how you walk up to somebody and they could be like putting on a roof and they'll say, "What you doing up there?" You know, really stupid question. Well, I had my husband's aunt. My husband was painting the porch, and she walked up on the porch, stepped on the painted area, and said, "What are you doing down there?" So, you know, so this is kind of a silly little, reminded me of Steve's aunt when she did this. But anyway, today I was at a local home improvement store purchasing a few bags of garden soil. As I waited in line to pay for my bags of dirt, a guy behind me spoke up. "You gonna do some planting?" I turned to him with a very serious face and said, "No, I'm buying my land back, one bag at a time. And this time I'm getting a receipt." The shock looked on the face of the other people was amazing. But anyway, that was just a little experience. Then I ran across this, so it kind of went together. Okay, this is what we who are age 70 or 80 years plus can look forward to. That's none of you guys. This is something that happened at an assisted living center. The people who lived there had small apartments, but they all ate at a central cafeteria. One morning, one of the residents didn't show up for breakfast, so my wife went upstairs and knocked on the door to see if everything was okay. She could hear him through the door, and he said that he was running late and would be down shortly, so she just went back to the dining room. An hour later, he still hadn't arrived, so she went back towards his room, but found him on the stairs. He was coming down the stairs but was having a hard time. He had a deft grip on the handrails and seemed to have trouble getting his legs to work right. She told him she was going to call an ambulance, but he told her, "Oh no, don't do that." He wasn't in any pain and just wanted to have his breakfast. So she helped him the rest of the way down the stairs, and he had his breakfast. When he turned to return to his room, he was completely unable to get up even for the first stair step. So they called the ambulance for him. A couple of hours later, she called the hospital to see how he was doing. The receptionist there said, "He's fine. He just had both of his legs and one side of his boxer shorts." And then it said, "I'm sending this to my children so they don't sell the house before they know all the facts."
Good one.
I could see somebody doing that. Not mentioning names. Excuse me. When I was going through some papers the other day, I ran across this poem I wrote several years ago. Proverbs tells us to consider the ants and how hard they work. Ants have an absolute wonderful system of working together to get the big job done. Sometimes we are stubborn or prideful and don't want to ask others to help, and we end up getting frustrated. We should be ready to ask for help when we need it, and also ready to help someone else when they need it. The ant, consider the ant. The ant, when he can't, doesn't rant or rave or throw up his hands and quit. He doesn't complain or point with disdain to reason why he can't do it. No, he gets another sister, or brother to come and help him bear it. So when life gets you down and you just want to frown and give up on all that's around you, consider the ant. And don't rant and rave. Call a friend who will help you through. For the load is much lighter, the outlook much brighter when someone is there to share. I just want to
Amen. Thank you.
okay. And never be a prisoner to your past. It was just a lesson, not a sentence.
Oh, that's good.
Oh, Miss Donna, you're amazing.
That's a good one to remember. Just a lesson, not a sentence.
Yes.
A comma, not a period. Well, it's good to see y'all here. You guys are dodging COVID like bullets out there. I know it's been pretty wild how it's going through so many folks, and but hopefully God is watching over each of us and taking care of us, whether or not we even contract it. I'm glad that this last wave hasn't been as severe as before. When Donna had mentioned the 2 legs in the same boxer, it reminded me of the old sack races. You guys ever been in a sack race before? Raise your hand. You can confess if you've been in. Wow, a lot of you have. I bet it's a generational thing. I don't think as many kids these days even know what a sack race is.
Thank you.
You know, because now we're so overprotective with our kids. It's like, you know, if they fall, it's like, whoa! We just threw all of our kids in one bag and told them to go as fast as they possibly could. So since y'all, it seems like so many of y'all have done it before, you probably got good experience. Some of you are probably some dark horses, can go pretty quick with the sack race still. So if we do ever pull off the Love Our City Festival, then we'll definitely have that, and we can compete. We'll have the 55 and older sack race competition, and we'll see who can make it through past the finish line, much less quickest. That will be the goal when it comes to that particular competition. So
We'll be crawling to the finish.
they'll be crawling. Yeah, there'll be limbs left in the wake of that race.
Have an ambulance here.
Yeah, that's right.
And we'll also do Twister right after.
Yeah, that's right. Twister. It'll be an obstacle course that we'll be doing a sack race through, so it'll be fun. So you guys are happy we weren't able to pull off the Love Our City Fest because of all this COVID, but we're hoping to get that going in the spring and have a lot of fun and not necessarily injure people, though. We have had a history of injuring people during fellowship type events, including the preacher. Some of you remember when the big volleyball pole hit me in the head within a few months of me starting work here. They had a big event, it was happening in the gym. I forget what it was called. It was just a thing that we did after church. It wasn't a thing. Might have been a thing. We called it a thing. I think it was a thing. It was Avalon Thing. And I was just hanging out. I forget what I was trying to pick up some chairs and put them away and jostled the big volleyball net pole. Those things are 60 pounds. I know how much they weigh because I looked them up after it fell on my head to see how much God actually loves me. At least 60 pounds worth, because there had to have been some type of guardian angel or something, because the edge of that thing caught right on the top of my head. Blood started pouring down. And of course, at the time Frank was there, the quickest one to respond, of course he's had so much history as an EMT and then firefighter and all that, that he knew exactly what I needed, just a whole lot of like cloth wrapped around my head. So that's what happened. I left out of that thing, and I actually drove myself to the dismay of so many people to an urgent care. I didn't want to have to go to an emergency room, but they gave me staples. And when the staples it was time to come out, I didn't want to go to the doctor to get that done. You can find staple removers from Amazon, so I bought one of those. Remove staples out of my head. So, yeah. I told you way more of that story than I probably should have, especially online, but there it is. That's how I operate. God was good enough to save me, and then I'm trying to destroy myself with my own staple removers. That has nothing to do with our lesson today. Though I could say that sack races could probably tie in, and I'll tell you how in just a moment. So the most famous battle fought in the Old Testament was not between two armies, but two individuals. That's one of your first blanks there. Does anybody need blanks for our time going through this material. We're going to try and cover like 56 verses or so today. So I took way too much time telling you stories. We're going to try and go through this fairly rapidly. But I wanted to cover a lot of detail in this encounter, famous encounter between these two individuals that I'm sure you've heard of before. But before we get to that, I want us to look at something that occurred before the battle that takes place, something that God said to Samuel. So this is back in Samuel 16. We're going to spend most of our time in 17. But just as a review, back in 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, we read, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him.'" Who's the Lord talking about? He's talking about Saul. Actually, no, he's talking about one of David's brothers. And in the process of trying to find who the next anointed one is going to be, the Lord says this, that he's rejected certain people along the way. And the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so we can sometimes be guilty of forming erroneous opinions, that is false opinions, fancy word, based solely on outward appearance. And so God is saying that's a tendency of ours to do that. We've talked about that. It's kind of human nature when it comes to even looking for leaders. But God looks past outward appearance into the heart. And so this statement to Samuel applies really to no other place more than it does in this battle story that we're going to see today. By all appearances, Goliath, on one side of the battle, should have struck fear in David's heart on the other side of the battle. He's the other individual. But David also saw with God's eyes through Goliath's outward appearance. And so David was not intimidated by this battle, which is quite remarkable as we go through it to kind of see the detail of the event itself. So follow along as we go through this text, and we want to welcome anybody who's joining us online as well. Spend a lot of our time in 1 Samuel 17, so you can follow along with us there. This is where we see the battleground, verse 1 of 1 Samuel 17. "Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between, there's a whole lot of names here, Socoh and Ezekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another with a valley between them." Okay, so this gives you a picture of the battleground. The valley of Elah was not just a little ravine, it was probably more like a canyon, probably about a mile wide. And at the bottom of this valley ran a riverbed where David, later in the story, finds his 5 smooth stones that he's going to use in the battle. So this is a large area. So don't just picture it like oftentimes you'll see in the cartoons that are shown with kids, like it's a little distance. No, when Goliath is shouting his insults to the Philistines and all that, he's doing it over a long distance. So that's how the battle lines are drawn. These two armies are facing each other. And so this is the setting that we get, and now we get a glimpse of the characters of this particular event. So that's where we continue in verse 4. "A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scaled armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him." Okay, a lot of detail on the appearance of Goliath because it's important on us picturing David's his lack of fear, his boldness, his bravery going into this battle. So it says Goliath was 6 cubits in a span. You guys know what that is, right? Easy. 6 cubits in a span, I was measuring that this morning. Well, actually what that translates to is somewhere near 9 foot, 9 inches tall. Right? So an average basketball hoop is about 10 feet. To help us picture that today, I just happen to have 3 by 3 foot boxes in my office. I'm not kidding, true story. Well, I didn't have it for this reason, but I thought, you know what? if I stack 3 by 3 foot boxes, one on top of the other, that'll kind of give you a good picture of the size of Goliath. So there we have 9 feet, but we also have another 9 inches. So here's what I'll do about that. Goliath needs another 9 inches. This is not quite 9 inches, but this will help. Goliath needs a head, so we're going to give him a head. Here's Chris on the ladder again. I just told you guys about my injuries before, so I'm going to have to knock the roof up a little bit. Let's see. Hopefully that's not asbestos. All right, we're good to go. Check it out. Impressive, isn't it? Yes. Thank you. You guys are applauding on the fact that I just made it off of that ladder alive. I understand. Kind of a small head for the size of the body there. This is kind of a Minecraft style Goliath. If you guys are familiar with that, you have grandkids that probably showed you about that. So this is our Goliath for the day. Imagine facing this size of a person who is not just standing there, but he has full battle armor on, and it describes the size of the armor. So he talks about this coat of mail, which is this metal vest that is worn by the Philistine that goes from the shoulder all the way down to the knee. That alone would have weighed somewhere between 175 to 200 pounds. All right, so a couple 100 pounds of just armor from that coat of mail that would have been slung over his shoulders down to his knee. And then Goliath also wore a bronze helmet, bronze leggings, and carried a bronze spear. The head of the spear alone weighed about 20 to 25 pounds, just for the head of the spear. And this is a spear is something you throw. This is not something he swung in battle. He threw it in battle. And so the guy's strong enough to do this, and so it's pretty impressive, the sight of him in this armor. He also had this shield carrier that you can see there in Scripture says that he went ahead of him, which means it is a full-sized man holding just a shield for him. All right, so the shield was the size of a full-grown man. So now imagine you're David standing in front of something like this. And David is not, a 30, 40-year-old full-grown man. He is still a young adult, if that. Late teenage years to young adult years at this point. And so it's quite an interesting difference between the two sides here with these individuals. So notice what this warrior does. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. And if he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. I wonder why. So Goliath actually suggesting a battle tactic, that is a blank there, battle, that was commonly used during this period, known as a representative battle, so that it would spare hundreds of lives, maybe thousands of lives, if the battle could be determined between two individuals as opposed to two armies. So this is kind of a humane way to have a battle. And so that's what Goliath is suggesting. I would suggest a sack race instead. That's even more humane. So you see how that comes back around? I told you it would come back around. If they would have had a sack battle, it would have been a lot less violent than even what we're going to see. But no, that's not what happened. So he's challenging them to this battle, representative battle. Now, obviously, it looks like the Philistines are going to have the edge in that battle for obvious reasons that we just talked about. So, of course, he would suggest that as the largest individual probably within sight in that time. So he's suggesting it not just once, but it says Goliath's challenge went on for 40 days. 40 days, morning and night. Goliath would come to the edge of this hillside, overlooking the canyon between the two of them, and he would shout the same challenge over and over again. So the Philistines were, Saul's men, the Israelites, were afraid of both going into war, into battle as a group, and most especially as individuals. There's no one that wanted to step up to this guy for good reason. So this challenge just keeps continuing here. Now for you and I, looking in this situation, we're probably not going to run into a guy like this in a Walmart parking lot who wants to fight us, right? Hopefully not. But we still face giants in life. And that's what we need to keep in mind. That giants can come in a lot of different forms. It can come in the form of a person, or it could be a pressure, an overwhelming pressure that you're facing, or a concern, a worry. And this is how it happens when a giant comes to us, right? They don't go away easily. It's not just that they shout a threat and then they're gone the next day. So this is how Goliath is showing up to these Israelites day after day, morning and night. He's reminding them of his presence, and it's an intimidating thing for him. We face those kinds of giants even today ourselves in many ways. So there's lessons that we can learn from this encounter, even that will apply to our lives, even at very different time and circumstance. So about 10 to 15 miles away, while all this is happening, in the Judean mountains, there's this teenage shepherd, David. And that's where we read about him in verse 12. David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Remember, we talked about last time, David now has a job with Saul. What's he doing? Playing the lyre, right? He's the musician who's helping Saul, especially in times of emotional upheaval and crisis, because he has this, says this in Scripture, this tormenting or evil spirit that is continually coming upon him. And when David played for Saul, that would bring relief to him. So that's David's job, and he's doing that part-time, and he's also shepherding on the hillside part-time. So he's got a couple jobs there at a young age. I like the guy. So, goes back and forth, tends father's sheep. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. So David at this point seems to be too young to fight in the army, and probably didn't know much about what was actually happening here on the battlefield just yet. And David's elderly father began to get worried, that's a blank, about his 3 eldest sons who were on the battlefield that we just read about. So these eldest sons are actually in the group of Israelites that are facing Goliath's threats. And so Jesse's worried about them, and so he calls David in to run an errand for him, and that's when it continues into verse 17. Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are, and bring back some assurance from them." Of course, he's trying to potentially bribe the commander to watch over his sons a little bit, and not necessarily put them in the front of battle. And they are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. So David actually never goes to the battlefield to fight. He basically is going as the water boy, bringing refreshments to his brothers. That was his initial reason for going and encountering what's happening with Goliath. His dad is sending him to bring refreshment to his brothers. So David the water boy shows up. And the day begins like any other. But the 41st day of Goliath's challenge would be the last day of his life, and the first day of David as a hero. So day after day, 40 days, this happens, and on that 41st day, or maybe the end of the 40th day, whichever it is between those two things, that's when everything changed really quickly. This is kind of how it happens, right? We have a giant we face, and we're continually facing that giant, and then God steps in and things change drastically like that. Sometimes it seems too late for us. It feels like it's too late, but it's always on time in God's timing. So that's how we see it happening here. David arose that morning to do what his father told him to do. We pick it up in verse 20. Early in the morning, David left a flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. So things seemed to be escalating here. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "You see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." Well, that might be worth it. No taxes. I don't know how pretty his daughter is, but no taxes. So, try and imagine what's happening with this teenage boy, what's going through his mind as he sees all this excitement that's happening. And all he knows to this point is really sheep and more sheep. You know, he's been there with Saul, and he's seen kind of what it's like to be in the throne room of the king of Israel, which really isn't too impressive yet. I mean, Israel isn't really an impressive kingdom until David actually takes over. But he sees some of that perspective, and then other than that, he's just out with the tending the sheep. And now all of a sudden he's in this situation at this age, and he sees this excitement. He's talking with his brothers. Here's this shout. A bunch of Israelites run past him and hide in their tents because they're terrified of the guy who's shouting. And then he looks to see what these men are running from, and he sees this, right? He sees the large, unusually large man with unusually destructive armor and weapons shouting challenges towards anybody who would fight him. And remember that the Israelites had been seeing this for days, right? So they're getting used to this scene. But this was the first time David had seen this sight. So this is his first impression when he sees this man. And so instead of getting scared, to blank, instead of getting scared, David actually becomes angry that this man would dare curse God. Listen to how he responds to this in the next few verses. David asked the men standing near him, verse 26, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." Right? So we already read about this incentive. Saul had devised an incentive to get someone to fight Goliath. So he was going to give him, riches, right? There's a payout, there's tax exemption, and then the daughter's hand in marriage, which more than just, fighting for the queen, this would be obviously a promotion, a pretty big job for you to be marrying into the royal family of Israel. So that was the incentive, and this is the best Saul could offer. So this is how desperate they are at this point, because Saul knows, the Israelites know, if they don't win this battle, they will be destroyed by the Philistines in this time. And so the ironic thing is that Saul is actually the one who's most qualified to actually fight Goliath, right? We talked about how Saul was probably the tallest man around in that time. Remember, one of the reasons he was chosen as a king was because he stood head and shoulders above a lot of other people who would have been the same candidates for that position. And in that time, leaders would have been the ones who would have led in battle. And so you see David do this when he becomes king of Israel. So it would have ultimately been his responsibility, and Saul may have had the most capability in terms of just natural ability to step into that challenge, but he doesn't want to take it. And I'm not sure I blame him too much unless I knew God was behind me in that battle. So David then faces a little of the older brother syndrome next in verse 28. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave these few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. who came down only to watch the battle. So you have the older brother. He's probably still kind of jealous about the whole Samuel anointing him thing. And so now he's basically trying to embarrass his younger brother in front of all of these other men. And so he challenges him there, and he says, why are you even there? Who's watching the sheep? And so here's how David responds. This just sounds like my own kids fighting with each other. Now what have I done? Can't I even speak? He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. Okay, so now Saul's finding out that David is interested. And Saul at this point, he's probably made this offer, and it's kind of been hanging out there, and nobody's taking it up. He's willing to work with anybody. So Eliab was the one who first walked into the house when Samuel was there, and Samuel thought Eliab was the king, if you'll remember. And then he was overlooked, as well as the other brothers, until David was called in to be anointed by Samuel. So Eliab was probably standing there and watching as the oil spilled over David's head, which would have been how Samuel would have anointed David for that position. So for our purposes, we need to be mindful of what it's like for us to be older Christians seeing younger Christians take on big battles and successes. It's important for us to not get the older brother or sister syndrome, the same syndrome that happened in the prodigal son story, and undercut the progress of people who are newer in the faith and maybe a little bit crazier than we would have been comfortable with when it comes to reaching people or fighting battles. So it's good for us to be reminded of them. That's the situation that Eliab is facing with his brothers, and we can face that on a spiritual level with our brothers and sisters in Christ. So Eliab asked these two questions, and this is something we can relate to, okay? So Eliab asked him first about David's true motive, and then he also asked the other question about the sheep that was designed to embarrass him. All right, so he asked, hey, why are you even out here? Why are you asking questions about the battle? Glad to see you're okay. We were going to send somebody back there to give you the CPR or Heimlich. I don't know what the latest is with it.
Or just knock me out then.
Yeah, that's all right. You all right?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I just have this cough, I'm sorry.
Yeah, once it comes, it's hard to get rid of it, that's for sure. Okay.
Thanks for thinking of me.
Yes, ma'am. So he asked two questions, one about David's motive, the other designed to embarrass him. Now notice David knew who to fight and who to leave alone. David responding to Eliab's challenges would have not made the situation any better. I've tried to say this to my own kids when they fight. But I do the same thing myself, right? Sometimes when people come after you, it's not that they were actually legitimately looking for an answer to their question. Their question has a different motive. And in those situations where you perceive their questioning to have a different motive than I just want the answer, it's better for you to leave it where it is and not respond in kind. That's where David seems to be reacting to his brother. He knew who to fight and who to leave alone. Instead of fighting with our own family in the church, perhaps attention should be turned elsewhere. At times, especially in times of jealousy or competition or things like that. So now the scene turns to Saul and David. Keep in mind that Saul is scared to fight Goliath. Otherwise, he would be out there fighting him. But Saul will not admit it. And so it's interesting, this interaction that David and Saul have here together. Chapter 17, verse 32. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." I mean, look at him. He's like a brick. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth." So it's not just David hanging out playing the guitar by the sheep. He's punching bears in the face to save sheep. So, not something that he would talk about typically, but here's a situation where he can share it, that's what he's been doing. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord, he rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Saul said, go, and the Lord be with you, to David. Doesn't have much to argue with him. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic, tried walking around because he was not used to them. I can't go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. All right, so, this man is willing now to go into battle without any armor because it doesn't fit right, or he's not used to them, whatever the reason is. But more than that, David probably knew what his true armor was. David knew that there was no giant, only a dwarf in the face of a true giant. Here's what Chuck Swindoll says in the book on this. He says, so often when facing our giants, we forget what we ought to remember and remember what we ought to forget. So David sees this. He doesn't see him outward appearance. He sees inwardly, and what he sees inwardly in this giant is a dwarf. So Saul is let off the hook, right? He doesn't have to go out in a battle. And he uses this spiritual cliche to basically cover up his emptiness and his fear. Go and God be with you. Like, that's as much as he can offer at this point. I imagine Saul's probably thinking to himself, this guy is done. He's not going to make it. Okay, so then it continues, verse 40. So then David took a staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of a shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, a Philistine with a shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy. Now, remember, this isn't like 15 steps that David takes towards the Philistine. He's walking. This is probably a half a mile journey, and they're all watching him slowly walk towards, from the ravine up towards the Philistine. And he gets close enough now that the shield bearer is like, okay, this guy's actually coming in a little bit closer than he should. Is this really someone who's going to challenge me, right? So that's the scene that I want us to picture. So the Philistine shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over, saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? So he's insulted at how little David has on as he's preparing for battle. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Oh, yeah? David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Remember his theme all the way through this thing? What has made David angry from the beginning was the fact that this Philistine is offending God and his armies. That's the perspective that David has. It's not personal. It's not just that the Philistine is coming after him or even his brothers. It is that God. It is that this Philistine is going after his God and those who represent him in this world. That's the source of David's bravery and strength. It's good to notice that. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. So when we do this sack race, this is the kind of trash talk I want you guys to be leveling. This day the birds will feast upon your carcass. Okay. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. God works best when human pride is out of the way. So David's source of courage is summed up in the words he used, the battle is the Lord's. The source of David's strength is not a heightened view of himself as opposed to the giant's view of himself. David has nothing to prove in this situation. He has nothing to lose. The battle is God's. Continues, verse 48. As the Philistines moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout, pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath, to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Shaaraim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. So David uses one rock, one sling, to beat a giant with over 200 pounds of armor. And then after the giant falls, he doesn't have to climb up on his ladder anymore. He can really pick him up from the ground, but he takes his head off and uses it as a trophy, and he takes the rest of his armor. Whoop! You guys are nervous, aren't you? I was nervous too right then. And then he puts the rest of his armor in his tent. So you can tell people that when you come to senior Bible study, you never know what's going to happen. We had a decapitation last week. It was pretty crazy. But David used that, defeated the army, the army of the Philistines with just one rock and 200 pounds of armor that this giant carried with him. The lesson that the Philistines learned that day was that Goliath was the dwarf and David was actually a giant compared to Goliath, because God was with him more than anything else. So for you and I, facing our own giants, whether they be emotional or spiritual, facing giants is normally an intimidating experience. Intimidating. Doing battle is normally a lonely experience, as it was for David out there by himself against this giant. Trusting God, though, is a stabilizing experience. That was the source of David's strength and his confidence. And then winning victories is a memorable experience. And you would not have a memorable experience unless you went through the intimidating ones. You wouldn't be stabilized unless you were having to face the lonely experiences as well. I just wonder how long David kept Goliath's armor as trophies. Probably the rest of his life. And so, if you're facing a giant today, here's what God is saying to you. All I ask from you is 5 smooth stones and a sling of faith. Take it from there. You don't have to wear someone else's armor. You just trust me. I'll strip you down to nothing but faith. Yet in the end, I'll accomplish victory. All right? So that's an encouragement to you. What a remarkable battle. It's definitely a popular one for young ones, but there's parts of the story we don't necessarily share as vividly with the young ones. But we get the whole story there in 1 Samuel 17. And it's a remarkable story because it is a picture of the kind of battles that we fight as well in very different ways when we face our own giants that we have to face. The way we get through them is the same way David got through this battle, with faith in a God who's stronger than anything that we can face. All right, so we're going to stop the stream and then jump into talking about some giants that people are facing, things that we can be praying for in the days ahead. We're keeping Floyd in prayer. He's home in hospice care, has been there for a little bit over a week now. And he has good days and bad days. I saw him yesterday. He was having a really good day. Shook his hand, talked with him a little bit, totally with it. And we prayed and joked. So that was a good day. Day before was hard on him. Just a lot of, and maybe adjusting to some of the medication that he has now and such, but a lot of confusion and dealing with nausea and stuff like that was what was happening on Monday. So just praying that he ends up with more good days than bad days. And she's fighting with shingles right now, so